Hello, Sandor. I'm Nerea. Thank you to be here with me. And we are doing this because on May we have a festival, a fermentation festival here in Spain, and I want to speak with you to know you better. And bueno, we start with the questions. I want to ask you, when did you start with the fermentation, with fermenting?
Well, my first experiences fermenting food myself were in 1993, so 26 years ago, which is the time when I moved from New York City, which is where I was born and raised, to rural Tennessee. And one thing that happened in that time is I started gardening. And so my fermentation practice really grew out of the garden. And, I was such a naive city kid that it never occurred to me that in the garden, all the cabbage would be ready at the same time and all the radishes would be ready at the same time. So really, my first experiences of fermentation were driven by the practical necessity to use vegetables, during the season when they were ready to harvest.
Okay, and did you know before this something about fermentation in your cooking or?
Sure. I mean, like most human beings living on planet Earth, I was familiar with certain products of fermentation, and my favorite product of fermentation as a kid was pickles. My grandparents were immigrants to New York City from Eastern Europe, what's now Belarus, and in the Jewish Eastern European culture that existed in New York, there were a lot of great pickles to eat in the Eastern European style. So it was a flavor I was definitely familiar with. I was familiar with sauerkraut. I was familiar with yogurt. As a kid, I just loved some of the flavors of fermentation. But I was drawn to some of the flavors of fermentation. And then before I moved to Tennessee and started actually fermenting myself, I spent a couple of years exploring macrobiotics. And macrobiotics was where I first got the idea that there was a specific digestive benefit to these pickles that I had been enjoying my entire life. And I started noticing that whenever I would eat these pickles, or even when I would look at them and smell them, now even when I think about them, I could feel my salivary glands under my tongue squirting out saliva. And so, really under the influence of macrobiotics, I first started to, observe that these foods literally got my digestive juices flowing. And so I started, making an effort to eat more fermented foods, but still, I hadn't really learned how to make them myself until I had this, very practical reason to do so.
Mm-hmm. Really, really close to me, because I started with the fermentation, first with macrobiotics, and then with the fermentation because I made the miso and pickles and other things and the pressed salads with macrobiotics, but after that I started with the fermentation and all the things. What were you doing before being an author and professor of fermentation?
Well, let's see. I worked as a high school teacher. Then I was working in municipal government in New York City for a couple of years. More than 30 years ago, I was running a community organization in New York City that was trying to stop Donald Trump from building a massive development on the west side of Manhattan. So, I was very involved in New York City and New York City politics, and I had a career in municipal government in New York.
Okay. When you decide that you wanted to leave bulk fermentation, or?
Well, it wasn't that straightforward. I made a decision to leave my job and leave New York partially because I happened to meet some people who lived in this rural community, and I met them at a moment when I was looking to make a big change in my life, and I was very intrigued by what they told me about this community, and I came and visited, and I was very enchanted by what I saw, and I started thinking, oh, maybe I need to leave New York City and try living in the country in this community context. So I really just walked away from my career in New York and joined this rural community in Tennessee, and my work for the community primarily involved gardening and cooking. And I really fell into fermentation at the intersection of gardening and cooking. And I mean, certainly for the first 10 years of my obsession with fermentation, it was not, it was not my job. I was just, this member of this community who got obsessed with fermentation and had, the space and the time to, really fully throw myself into the exploration of fermentation. And it was only after, about 10 years of that it occurred to me that I could write a book. And so, I wrote my book, and then I organized a promotional tour of workshops to try to promote my book. And the workshops turned out to be so popular that I really have never stopped doing that. So I started doing that in 2003, and by a couple of years later, I was spending most of my time traveling around teaching fermentation workshops, which is what I'm still doing.
Okay. How has fermentation transformed your life?
Oh, well, I mean, it's very hard to say. I mean, I mean, certainly my decision to write about fermentation and teach about fermentation has given my life a whole different direction than I was on before. The actual foods themselves, it's a little bit hard to say because, as I said at the beginning, I have always enjoyed fermented foods. I grew up eating fermented foods, so it wasn't that there was just one moment when I made the decision to embrace fermented foods. They were always part of my life. What I will say is that, I described to you that, through macrobiotics, I started recognizing that these foods that I had been eating my entire life would make my saliva come out. And I started associating them with a good digestion. And then I also started realizing that there were a lot of ideas about probiotics and how the bacteria in living fermented foods could stimulate the immune function. And because I've been living with HIV infection since 1991, ideas like immune function and getting the most nutrition out of the food that I'm eating, seem very powerful to me because, I have this condition which could easily compromise my health. I need to be clear with you and with everybody that, I have not cured HIV using fermented foods, and I do take HIV medications every day. But most people I know who are on these medications have digestive problems related to the medications, and I've never had any of that. I feel like in general, my immune function seems to be doing very well, and to some degree, I attribute that to eating live fermented foods regularly. So, my life, like anybody's life, it has many different factors. And so, it's hard to say that, my well-being at this moment in my life is primarily due to fermented foods and beverages, because there are many factors that go into it. But, certainly I believe that one of the factors that's enabling me to, maintain good health and strong energy, is the regular consumption of foods and beverages, and really fermented foods and beverages. And really, when I notice it most is sometimes when I travel and I don't have access to the kinds of fermented foods that I typically eat every day, I can feel my digestion slowing down. So I feel like I have very strong evidence that, the regular consumption of fermented foods really, keeps my digestion very healthy to the degree that I notice it when these foods are absent.
Did you ever felt that you went too far of consuming fermented food or something?
No, I have never felt that way, but I have never attempted to eat exclusively fermented foods. I love food. I love all kinds of foods. I love raw foods. I love fresh vegetables and fresh fruits. I love almost everything. So I have, except for a couple of years when I was really following a macrobiotic diet, I eat virtually everything. I'm not following a restrictive diet. I do not eat exclusively fermented foods. Yes, I think it is possible for people to eat too much fermented foods. Some fermented foods are very salty. I think salt is a limiting factor. So if the fermented food is very salty, you want to eat a limited amount of it. Some of the lightly fermented beverages have a lot of sugar. I think that, any food with a lot of sugar should be used in moderation. Of course, fermentation produces alcohol. I enjoy alcohol, but I think it's important to use alcohol in moderation. So I think that, just because fermented foods and beverages have special nutritional powers doesn't mean that eating more of them is better. Or that eating only them is the best thing that you can possibly do. I think that, their place is, in a balanced diet that includes lots of different foods and lots of different kinds of foods and different preparations. And, fermentation is very important, but, it is not the only good way to prepare food. It is not the best way to prepare food. And, I think its proper role is, in the context of a broader and more diverse diet.
Okay. Is there a fermentation process that you like more than another one?
Oh, that is such a hard question. I mean, what I can tell you is that I'm very, very devoted to fermenting vegetables, sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles. This is certainly the fermentation process that I have practiced the most personally. It's the kind of fermented food that I eat most frequently. But I mean, I don't think I could say it's my favorite. I mean, I really I love how widespread fermentation is. I love how any food can be fermented. Really for me, the magic of fermentation is, how widely applicable it is, how it can be used in so many different kinds of ways. So, yes, I'm very devoted to fermented vegetables, but, I also love cheese and all the incredible different textures and flavors that, we can create from milk using fermentation. I love fermenting grains. I love eating Indian dosas and Ethiopian injiras and making sourdough rye bread. And I think that, fermentation unlocks the nutrient potential of grains, and it gives them more exciting flavors, and it gives them a lighter texture. So, I love many different kinds of fermentation. And although I'm very, very devoted to sauerkraut, I don't think I can say it is my favorite.
Okay. What is the fermented food that is most abundant in your meals on your day?
Typically, I would say fermented vegetables, and typically I have more than one style in my kitchen at a given time. So right now I have these fermented daikon radishes that I made in November, and so they're 4 months old now. They're really, really sour, and I love that. And then a friend of mine gave me some fermented beetroot, which is really, really delicious. I've been enjoying that so much, and the jar of that is almost gone. I also have some beautiful kimchi that I made a couple of months ago that's like very, very spicy, sharp, but delicious. So what I tend to do is vary them. And so, at one meal I'll have one style, at another meal I'll have another style. And I'll include those in most meals. I also love to incorporate yogurt into things. I eat lots of different kinds of fermented foods, but I would say that the most frequent and regular ones that I eat are fermented vegetables. Okay.
Do you think that this passion that exists for fermentation is only something temporary, or that is has come to stay?
Well, I think it's always been here.
Yes.
If we think about the celebrated products of fermentation, wine, beer, bread, cheese, cured meats, olives, pickles, kimchi, sauerkraut. These foods have enjoyed enduring popularity throughout history. And, what I would say is that people have enjoyed these foods in recent decades without knowing about fermentation, without thinking about fermentation. And this is really a result of, people in general becoming more and more distanced from the ways in which their food is produced. So, 100 years ago, fermentation was less centralized. So, most people would be seeing evidence of even if it wasn't being done in their family's home. In their community, they would see evidence of fermentation and have some general understanding of the process. But because over the course of the 20th century, the production of food from agriculture to the factory has been largely centralized, and fewer people are directly involved, fewer people understand the process. So fermentation has become very mysterious. And this happened during the same period of time as people became afraid of bacteria. We began to think of bacteria primarily as dangerous agents of disease. And we all were indoctrinated by what I like to call the war on bacteria, to believe that we had to fear bacteria. Microbiology in the last couple of decades has been telling us a much more nuanced story. And there's a broad understanding that bacteria are the matrix for all life, that a healthy human body is the host to a vast number of bacteria, trillions of bacteria that exist in elaborate biodiversity and assist us in regulating all kinds of physiological processes. So we really are dependent on bacteria. And meanwhile, the biodiversity in our bodies has been diminished by exposure to chemicals like antibiotic drugs and antibacterial cleansing products and chlorine in water. And so fermented foods and probiotic supplements, suddenly look much more attractive as, ways that we can rebuild biodiversity and improve our digestion and improve our immune function. And I think that, this is why we're seeing so much new interest in fermentation, is because people are recognizing how important bacteria are. I'm certainly happy that there's renewed interest and passion about fermentation, but I like to remind people that fermentation is not a new trend in food production, and fermentation is not a fad, and it's just been, an integral part of food traditions, in Spain, as in almost everywhere in the world.
Okay. What new interest or research on fermentation are you working on?
Well, one thing that I've been working on, which has been very exciting, is more and more photographing ferments. So I have a microscope and a stereoscope, and so I can do a little bit of it myself. But I've been working with a laboratory at a nearby university using their scanning electron microscope to be able to look at the microbial communities of fermentation, much more up close. So that's been an incredibly exciting project that I've been working on, and really the organisms of fermentation are just so beautiful and visually stunning. So I've been enjoying that, and I'm also always learning about different kinds of ferments. I mean, right now I'm making a Chinese ferment of fava beans and chili peppers called doubanjiang. When I went to China a couple of years ago, I visited a factory where they were producing it, and just based on my observations and conversations with them, I've been able to make some doubanjiang for myself at home, which has been very, very fun and exciting. But I'm constantly trying to learn about the processes for making different kinds of ferments, and fermentation is a vast realm of human creativity and activity, and there are nearly infinite manifestations of fermentation. And so even after 26 years of studying this, I keep learning about new ferments and trying to learn how to make them.
What advice will you give to a person who has just started in this field?
Well, I mean, generally, I encourage people to begin with fermenting vegetables. Vegetables are plentiful and easily accessible. I think that fermenting vegetables is really much more wholesome and supportive of good health than, fermenting a sugar water solution, which is really what many ferments are. If people are nervous about fermentation, there's nothing safer than vegetable fermentation. I mean, there are no recorded cases anywhere in the world of food poisoning or illness from fermented vegetables. So if you're nervous about it, fermented vegetables are a perfect way to start. It's incredibly easy. You take some vegetables, chop them or grate them, lightly salt them to taste. There's no magic number of how much salt you use. Salt it to taste, add other seasonings if you like. Then I like to get in and squeeze with my hands. And what this does is it breaks down cell walls and helps release juice, and the vegetables get very juicy. And then you just take your juicy vegetables and stuff them into your vessels, which can just be a simple jar, or it could be more elaborate, like a ceramic vessel or a wooden barrel. But a jar is easy. A liter jar will take about 1 kilo of vegetables to fill up, and then you wait. And you could wait, 3 days. You could wait a couple of weeks. You could wait a couple of months if you're in a cool environment. But you don't have to wait that long. Just taste it at regular intervals every few days. Try to keep it submerged, and that's how easy it is. I mean, it's just like absurdly simple. So I just think that that's the perfect place to start. But of course, if there's a particular fermented food or beverage that you're interested in, I mean, none of it is rocket science. It's all very accessible. The practice of fermentation is really a matter of manipulating environments. And so what you're trying to do is create conditions that encourage the growth of certain organisms and simultaneously discourage the growth of other organisms. So with fermenting vegetables, that's getting the vegetables submerged under their own juices or liquid that you add. But other ferments, it might be a temperature range, it might be stirring it frequently, but really the key is just understanding what that environment you're trying to create is. And that's really the whole key to the practice of fermentation. But vegetables are really just so easy, so straightforward, and that's where I would recommend that most people begin.
Okay. Fermentation can have some kind of danger to health, or?
Well, I mean, in general, no. I mean, these foods are popular foods that have been, enjoyed in cultures all around the world. However, I mean, sometimes people have particular conditions. Sometimes people have, let's say, blood pressure concerns, and they're being told to minimize salt intake. So you can make your fermented vegetables much less salty. But if you're in this condition, then you want to be careful with the salt. There are people who have thyroid problems and can't eat cabbage or other vegetables in that family. So then they wouldn't want to eat sauerkraut that's made from cabbage. But then maybe it's better you could ferment carrots, or you could ferment beetroots. I mean, any vegetables can be fermented. You could ferment green string beans. I hear sometimes from people who have a sensitivity to histamines, and histamines are compounds that are produced in many ferments. So, I mean, there may be some individuals that have conditions that could make it so they need to avoid certain kinds of fermented foods. But, I think in general, these foods are very safe. And, I would certainly counsel moderation. Just because these foods are supportive of good health doesn't mean you should eat them in vast quantities. I think moderation is important, especially for people who don't have experience with these foods. Just to begin with very small portions, see how they make you feel. Sometimes people go through some intestinal discomfort, and then generally it resolves itself. But if you eat a lot of these foods, then you might have more intestinal discomfort. So start with small portions and see how it feels. But except for certain very specific medical conditions that might make it so that certain fermented foods could make your health worse. In general, for most people, they will make your health better, or possibly have no effect.
Mm-hmm. And something you can think to finish this interview, or something you want to say, or?
Well, I mean, the only thing that I would say is that I'm so excited to be coming to Spain and participating in the fermentation festival there. And I know that there's a lot of interest in Spain because I've taught a couple of times there, and I'm very excited to be coming back. And I look forward to meeting you and meeting some of the other people watching.
Really happy to be here with you and to stay with you on May here in Pamplona, and with a lot of people here that they are to come here to see you and see our school and our festival. We are really, really, really happy. And thank you for this interview, and see you soon here in Pamplona.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.